Miscellaneous business. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, I so move. What I want to debate today, Mr Speaker, is the National Government's decision to flog off the New Zealand-owned community assets that belong to all of us as Kiwis, to corporate and to foreign investors. And Mr Speaker, I've noted that the National Party is desperate not to debate this. They're desperate not to debate this because every one of those national members know that when they go back to their electorates, New Zealanders and their constituents don't want those assets sold. Now, they are so desperate to avoid it that they are building an elaborate deceit around what's going to happen. They say, we're not going to sell it all, we're only going to sell some of them. Only going to sell some of them. But then along comes Dr Brash. Dr Brash, manipulated into his position by Stephen Joyce for the purpose of creating a smokescreen for National to do after the election, if the country is so unfortunate that it won it, what it will not tell New Zealanders that it intends to do before the election. And mark my words, Mr Speaker, Don Brash, who's pulling the strings, says he wants the whole of the assets flogged off, and the advice, Mr English, from your Treasury officials is to do just that. And Bill English hasn't told that to the public. Mr Speaker, I want to know why it would make any sense at all for any country, any business or any individual to flog off the assets that are the most valuable assets that they own. You know, the Prime Minister said a couple of months ago that the proceeds from the state-owned enterprises paid for our doctors and our hospitals. You know, and he's right, Mr Speaker, he's right. Take the three state-owned power companies. Between them, they returned $700 million to Kiwis. And that offsets the taxation that the government would otherwise need to pay for a whole lot of services. So I ask Mr English, why is he so keen, as he did in February or January of this year, to bail out failed private enterprise finance companies, entailing a liability of $1.7 billion? Why Mr English is so keen to bail out foreign-owned media companies that can't pay what they should be paying for the airwaves? Why is he picking up the duds from the private sector that want to socialise their losses at the same time as he wants to sell our assets that are the most valuable assets that we have? Mr Speaker, the other elaborate disguise is that this will go to the mum and dad investors. You know, that's what Mr English told us when he privatised Contact Energy back in 1999. And what happened to Contact Energy? Do you know, Mr English, that every year $100 million of money generated by the Clyde Dam that we built and we paid for goes out of this country to foreign investors? $1 billion lost from New Zealand since National privatised Contact Energy in 1999. And what about the Bank of New Zealand? Now, the Bank of New Zealand was also privatised by National. You know they sold it. What did they get for it? $1.5 billion. You know how much money the National Australian Bank has made out of the Bank of New Zealand for that price of $1.5 billion? $12.4 billion of New Zealand money that has gone out of this country and across the Tasman. And they want to do more of it. They want to flog off the rest of the banks. I say thank God for the last Labor government that, far from selling any assets, actually set up Kiwi Bank and provided some real competition that stopped $2.5 billion just going out of the country to the Aussies. And now Mr English says, but we've got to sell to retire debt. That man is borrowing $300 million a week. $300 million a week. You know how long the proceeds from the assets of our state-owned power companies will last, Mr Speaker, at that rate? About 8 months. 8 months, we'll still be borrowing $300 million a week, but we've lost the asset and we've lost the dividend stream from it, Mr Speaker. How can that make sense? When will this national government learn from history? The sale of the Bank of New Zealand, the sale of New Zealand Rail, all of them were duds, all of them are failures. Let New Zealanders keep the assets they own now.
The question is that the motion